I want to talk to you today about an old paper that we are in the process of publishing and then updating going forward. So this presentation is a bit of a mishmash of what we found when we did our last survey, but also wanting to get your feedback on how we can improve this survey going forward, because we want to scale it up and move it to different cities and improve the methodology and the rigor of it. So I'm going to present our findings on the perceptions and the implementation of sustainable finance with evidence from the City of London. So how I'll do this, I'll speak quickly about the research background and the hypotheses and why we wanted to do this study in the first place. I'll talk through the survey methodology that we implemented and the statistical analysis that we used, and then I'll talk through the results. And then I'll also update you on what's happened since, because this was a 2017 survey, and one of the problems with academia and the great things about academia is that the peer review process is there. It's kind of the bane of our life, as well as a real opportunity to share and encourage rigor in all the work that we do, but it also means in the rapidly evolving area of sustainable finance that things go out of date very quickly and probably before you can publish. So I'll update you on what's happened since, and then I want to talk through some of the future research designs and directions that we have and ask for your feedback on those. So the research background and the hypotheses. So there's been a growth in knowledge and practice of sustainable finance, as I'm sure that we're all aware. And it's well documented, but actually there hasn't been much research done on, as far as we're aware, on the city level. There's lots of different surveys at the national level and the international level, but actually drilling down into what does sustainable finance look like in London, what does it look like in New York, how does New York vary from San Francisco, and how does that vary from Beijing? And that's one of the things that we really want to look at. And we're aware that there's a survey that's been introduced since we published this, or since we started this survey, which I'll talk a bit about later. But we started this research in early 2017 with the City of London Green Finance Initiative, which has now just become the City of London Green Finance Institute. So again, there's lots of dynamism there. But they wanted to understand where green finance was in 2017 in London and how it can be used, how that information can be used to really scale up the level of ambition and the policies and the incentives within London to implement green finance as a competitive advantage for the financial system in London, especially in light of Brexit. You know, we need to be good at something, so it may as well be green finance. So these are some of our rationales. City level is important in financial markets. Cities, and especially large financial centres such as London, are important concentrations of financial transactions and expertise. They're also important in creating the expected market cultures, and there's lots of literature that talks around the importance of cultures, institutional structures and incentives linked to the policy environments that occur at the city level. So how does that link to sustainable finance? The rhetoric around sustainable finance has become more commonplace, and London is one of those centres for that in Europe and globally. But further analysis is needed to understand to what extent the rhetoric has actually become mainstream. And without understanding these current practices, it's hard to understand how sustainable finance is being disseminated and how can we ratchet up best practice going forward. So London as a sustainable finance centre is important, and we want to understand the extent to which practice is happening and how it can be improved. So it's a useful taste test for our survey, and also a baseline for future comparisons. And I'll talk more in the future directions about how we want to scale this survey up to compare across different cities. So we tested a few hypotheses. London is perceived as a leader in sustainable finance. London is characterized by a heterogeneous sustainable finance market. That should say 3 and 4, but ESG risks are viewed as prescient in current market activities, and that gaps in provisions and barriers to sustainable finance remain prevalent. So what did we do? So we, through an iterative process and in discussion with academics and practitioners, we created a survey of 50 questions that we sent out to practitioners and experts in sustainable finance. These questions were quite diverse and covered everything from contextual information, and then also looked at awareness and practice and perceptions and participation in the sustainable financial sector, and perceptions around the opportunities, risks, and challenges in sustainable finance. We had a specific focus on green bonds, as that was an area of interest to the City of London initiative at the time, and then also looking at London in a global context. So this survey was distributed between July and December 2017, and we emailed 2,337 institutions, of which we got 75 responses. So I'll say here, we know that this is a small sample, and we're not claiming any representation that this is, we are trying to find trends and then develop hypotheses for future research going forward. But this gave us, we try to reduce biases in a number of different ways, including giving access to the findings of individuals and guaranteeing anonymity. This doesn't reduce all the biases, and I'll go into that a bit later, talking about how we want to reduce biases further going forward. So 47% of our survey respondents were institutional investors, 29% were thought leaders and kind of experts in sustainable finance, and then 19% were investment service providers. So the survey responses came from a wide range of different organizations, but the assets under management were significant. So although we can't claim representation, we can say that there are important findings that we can share as a result of this research. And actually there was a significant amount of money being put into responsible investment, by these companies. So it's not that they didn't have any interest in sustainable finance, and they didn't have any vested interest, as over half had at least 10% of their assets under management in sustainable investments. So what did we do with the data analysis? We looked across all different types of responses, so did different groupings of individuals across different organization types and across different experiences with sustainable finance, and using different statistical testing. So the Kruskal-Wallis test and then the Dunn-Z test to estimate and to cross-examine different organization types. And so using these, you can test how two groups of practitioners behave statistically significantly different from each other. So what did we find? So we wanted to test London as a sustainable finance leader, as I said at the beginning, and 54% of our responses said that London was considered a leader in sustainable finance. Only 18% said it was not. So this is an important finding in the fact that actually there's a bit of unknown as to whether sustainable finance, whether London is a leader. There are varying different perceptions, and I'll go into the different cities in a minute. So actually, you can see on this graph on your right that actually, when asked 1 to 3, actually 3 kind of middling levels of perception as to whether London is a developed and broad market for ESG. We then dug a bit deeper and wanted to know which parts of the ESG and sustainable finance offerings are most well known within London. And the Green Investment Bank was one of them, but also renewable and alternative energy funds, ESG expertise, and emissions reporting were among the most. This was undertaken in 2017 when the Green Investment Bank was in the news a bit more. So to what extent that biased the decisions we'll see in future surveys with that. And London's ESG and sustainable finance networks and ESG expertise were ranked the highest among the different offerings within London, within our participants. So then looking at which financial centres were actually ranked well in our survey. So London did come out top, but that was followed closely by New York, and by Paris and New York, and Amsterdam, Frankfurt, etc. And actually, one of the things that this shows is that although London is ranked the highest, it was still only seen as kind of a 3 out of 5 on how broad it is. So there's obviously a desire that sustainable finance isn't great anywhere. It's not perfect. So how can we improve that going forward is a key question. And I should say that most of our responses were from London to try and gain the level of expertise, but that will have also biased the judgment. So going forward, we want to widen the geographies of the participants taking part. London was shown to be fairly mature, with actually a majority of the respondents having more than 7 years of sustainable finance expertise and experience. So what actually affects sustainable finance practice in London? So we were asked again, the participants to rank on a scale of 1 to 5, these different factors. And you can see that a supportive regulatory and policy environment is the most important factor, followed by supportive market infrastructure. So this question was asked to try and give a sense of how we can incentivize and improve market practice in London going forward by encouraging these things. We wanted to look at the heterogeneity in sustainable finance across different asset classes. The large majority of the asset managers we talked to were most interested in sustainable equities, and that was statistically significant compared to other investor types, whereas banks as an investor class were more interested in green bonds. Again, we want to test whether these are significant now that with a larger proportion, but this gives us some research from which to test future hypotheses. Further, while large variation existed, ESG factor analysis, positive and negative screening, and direct engagement were all the most frequently employed strategies among different between different investor groups. And these are in line with other literature, such as the Global Sustainable Investment Reviews of 2016 and 2018 since then. We did statistical testing showing kind of how these different groups changed across asset classes. And for example, stranded assets exposure was shown to be more likely to be used by asset managers than asset owners and banks. And we want to, again, continue that strand of analysis going forward. But we found homogeneity in the sustainable finance motivations across different investor groups. And this is an important part of the behavioral finance literature to try and understand the motivations and the preferences of sustainability practitioners going forward. So actually we found that it's a strategic priority was 55% of our survey respondents and only an executive priority for 24. So that's actually a really important finding if we can show that it's going forward to make sure that actually how we incentivize, whether from top down or bottom up, can be important. We looked at perceptions of climate risk and which different factors in climate risk are more important to our respondents, and found that actually different types of climate risk, whether that's physical, transition, or liability risk, are actually pretty similar. But environmental challenges and regulatory risks ranked higher, with litigation risk and falling renewable energy costs ranked lower. A really important finding, and probably surprising in 2017, maybe less so now, was that physical climate risk, liability risk, and transition risk were all ranked as very important now, rather than medium or long-term risk. And this is really important, that we try and reframe how we talk about these risks, because there's no use talking about them in long term if they're already happening now. And I think as we experience more climate change going forward, that will only become more obvious. But we did also find some gaps in the sustainable finance market information availability. So only 42% of asset owners were receiving any kind of sustainable finance advice, and only 58% were satisfied with it, whereas only 33% of asset managers were receiving related advice, and only 17% were satisfied. Only 13 organizations that we Only 13 organizations that we surveyed out of the 75 that responded had any research capacity or budgets relating to sustainable finance research. And this means that there's a great opportunity for GraphC researchers to generate this decision-relevant research and actually work with these practitioners to make sure that they are getting relevant and useful research and advice if they're not doing this in-house. So briefly looking at what's happened since. So there's been various different policy initiatives and also market initiatives. So the Bank of England has published its new supervisory expectations, and that caused a lot of stir within the markets of the expectation that sustainable finance should be and considered a material systemic financial risk and how that should be integrated within decision-making in the markets. There's also been UK policy regulation around the legislation of net zero, and that creates, a previous slide showed that policy uncertainty is one of the kind of key factors affecting sustainable finance. So if we now have this legislation going through to 2050 and it's net zero, how will that change the markets? It will be significant to test going forward. The UK Green Finance Institute has been set up to convene and lead mission-led coalitions made up of networks of dynamic decision makers to identify and unlock barriers to deploy capital at pace and scale towards impactful real economy outcomes. And that's going to be a great kind of clearinghouse for different information and research ideas and networks going forward. And also the UK Green Finance Strategy has been published. And that's really important as it the largest, kind of the first major economy to create a green finance strategy for the nation, kind of showcasing that the UK is open for green finance. And then also the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, which will have broader market implications. Another thing that I wanted to draw to your attention is the fact that kind of one of the key reasons why we did this survey was the fact that we didn't think that there was city-level analysis going on for sustainable finance. This has been taken up by the Global Green Finance Index, which is an NGO-led kind of initiative to try and create a ranking and a rating for different cities around the world. So since our survey's been done, they've done 3 different generations of this survey. It's available online and is just open source survey data, and it aims to foster a discussion of what is meant by green financial centre and encourage a race to the top among financial centres. So this is open online and has been since 2018, and they do 6 monthly reviews and results analysis. So in March 2019, which was the latest survey by the GGFI, Amsterdam came first for depth. The GGFI test depth and quality. So Amsterdam came first for depth, with Zurich and Copenhagen equal second. And London had dropped to 5th place, having come first in 2018. So we're really interested in rerunning our own survey and scaling up to test whether kind of the perceptions that we find with Amsterdam leading and other European cities leading and London falling in the quality and quantity of green finance. So in the quality ratings, London and Paris remain in top place. And then they also scale out to North America and Asia as well. So what do we want to do based on our survey and all the things that have happened since? So we recognize that there are a number of limitations to our survey and to our research. The survey is now out of date, and we do want to update it. We also have a small sample size, which has limited the insights that we're able to give and the statistical analysis possible. We're not aiming to be representative, as I said at the beginning, and we're also geographically limited to London. And that was a conscious decision, but we recognize we need to change that going forward. So we will rerun and update our survey and try and create temporal comparisons and scale up our research ambition going forward. So how will we do this? The future ambition is to kind of analyze the top 10 cities that the GGFI have identified through their survey. But their survey is very broad, and they don't do any statistical analysis on the results. So we want to give an academic perspective to a similar survey and work with them going forward to try and understand how we can best kind of drive this race to the top for green finance and provide both practitioners and academics a better sense of what is going on in the markets in different cities. And then also think more carefully about the different characteristics that are driving each city. Do deeper cross-sectional analyses across different organizational types, different levels of experience and different geographies, and also use different literatures to analyze the results and provide hypotheses and theories of why the trends that are occurring. So maybe using behavioral finance economics to understand the preferences and their levels of cognition going around. So what new questions will we be asking? So we want to look at the perceptions of the policy landscape. This is changing quite rapidly in sustainable finance, so we want to see how that is having an impact. We want to identify areas of sustainable finance innovation in each city and how they might differ globally, because we would hypothesize that what is happening in London, for example, and Beijing is very different from what is happening in sustainable finance in San Francisco. We also want to explore more active ownership practices around different investor types and geographies, which links into our broader program on the future of engagement. We want to look at the educational landscapes and to what extent GraphC and academic institutions can work with practitioners in different areas and different cities, and then also identify unique city-level characteristics that are driving sustainable finance with the effort to try and understand whether sustainable finance is characterized more on a city level or the global level. So thank you very much. Please provide feedback on anything you've heard. We're very keen to make this survey better and more useful to practitioners and academics alike. So thank you very much.